Hello, welcome. In this video I would like us to consider a video hosted on Friended Forever's second channel called The Think Club. The video title is Religion is an Evolutionary Adaption and features Dr Bret Weinstein, who some of you might recognise as the central figure in the Evergreen College fiasco. Now, Friended has been exploring the validity of anti-theism, and in doing so he often references a supposed scientific consensus relating to the evolutionary utility of religion. The thesis is that religion is an evolutionary adaptation and not, as some scientists like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris or Daniel Dennett suggests, comparable to a mind virus. So in making his case, Friended has introduced us to a Big Think interview featuring Dr Weinstein, who is an evolutionary biologist and seems to support Friended's tentative hypothesis. So let's listen to what Dr Weinstein has to say. Don't worry, it's only 2 minutes long, but listen carefully because I will explain in some detail why, in my opinion, Dr Weinstein, as an evolutionary biologist, gets it wrong.
The genome creates a brain that is capable of being infused with culture after an individual person is born. If culture was evolving to do things that were not in the genome's interest, they would effectively be wasting the time and resources that the genetic individual has access to on frivolous things at best. So the genome would shut down frivolous culture were it a very common commodity. So the theory of memes tells us that there is a process very much like the one that shapes our genomes at work in the cultural layer. That does not mean, however, that the cultural evolving layer is free of obligation to the genome. In fact, the cultural layer is downstream. The fact that we are primarily culturally informed tells us that culture serves the genetic interests almost all of the time, which is to say, if you look at a long-standing cultural trait, it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's music or religion or humor, all of those things must be paying for themselves in terms of genetic fitness. Once we've recognized that, we can skip to the much more interesting question of in what way do some of the remarkable cultural structures that we see serve genetic interests. Some of them seem absolutely paradoxical if we try to imagine that they are serving our genomes. And yet, that is the conclusion that we have to reach when we realize that the genome is not only tolerating the existence of that culture, but it is facilitating its acquisition. This suggests a very odd state of affairs for human beings, in which we have minds that are programmed by culture that can be completely at odds with our genomes. And it leads to misunderstandings of evolution, like the idea that religious belief is a mind virus, that effectively these belief structures are parasitizing human beings and they are wasting the time and effort that those human beings are spending on that endeavor, rather than the more reasonable interpretation, which is that these belief systems have flourished because they have facilitated the interests of the creatures involved.
What we have in this piece is not a single error, but a series of minor misapprehensions that, when aggregated, allow Dr. Weinstein to come to the conclusion that he did. He is also conflating at least two levels of abstraction, probably because of time constraint, but we will need to separate these for clarity. On the one hand, we are considering evolutionary processes at the genetic level, and on the other hand, we are being asked to consider memes, which operate at a higher cultural level. And while culture cannot be considered as independent, it is distinct. Evolution at the genetic level is driven by physical environment, while memes evolve in a shared cognitive environment, which itself is the product of genetic evolution. So genes and memes, while sharing many characteristics, are operating in two very different environments, something we will return to later. Dr. Weinstein suggests that the evolutionary process would shut down frivolous culture if it was of no benefit to the genome. We can imagine here Richard Dawkins' selfish gene. If some adaptation is of no benefit, it would be erased from the genome by natural selection. There are 2 points we might consider here. The first is there is an assumption that evolution produces an optimal solution, and the second that non-beneficial adaptations will be eliminated by natural selection. In relation to the first point, evolution often selects for the best option, not necessarily the optimal solution. The reason we need to make this distinction is simple. Evolution occurs in incremental stages. The spider's web is an optimal solution for a particular problem, but the evolution of the spider's eye is simply the best of a bad job. Evolution provides the best solution given the blueprint it had to work with. There are many examples of this in the natural world. The human eye is not particularly well designed. It is a good solution for a particular problem, but it is not optimal. Richard Dawkins uses the example of the giraffe's laryngeal nerve, which makes an extraordinary detour around the giraffe's dorsal aorta. The same detour is made in humans. The second point is the elimination of adaptations which are of no benefit to the genome. This is only true if the mutation is detrimental. If we think about random mutations, there are 3 potential outcomes. First, that the mutation results in a beneficial adaptation. We would expect this to be carried forward and even amplified by natural selection. Second, the outcome might be detrimental, adversely affecting the fitness of the organism, and we might expect this adaptation to be eliminated from the gene pool. But we also have an overlooked third potential outcome, which is a mutation that is neither beneficial nor detrimental to the organism. It's just a random mutation. This would neither be amplified or eliminated. It becomes a passenger until perhaps in the future it either hinders the organism in some way or perhaps becomes a future beneficial adaptation. Genes are indifferent to many things that are of concern to us. Diabetes, arthritis, dementia. These have not been selected out of our gene pool, nor will they be. At the level of the genome, replication is the engine that drives the evolutionary process. The selfish gene is indifferent to outcomes beyond a certain point in the life cycle. The next thing we need to consider is the nature of culture itself. This can often be a confusing concept because the term is used broadly. We have popular culture, high culture, received culture, and so on. But to put it simply, culture is everything that is learned. Primates have culture, and it varies from troop to troop. When we consider our primate cousins, we stand at the boundary between biology and culture. Humans have the capacity for language acquisition. This is an innate trait. It is genetic. But there is no gene for English or French, only for language acquisition. Your mother tongue depends on the culture in which you find yourself. There are no genes for writing. The written word is a cultural artifact. This obviously depends on language ability, but it is not in itself an evolved trait. Neither is mathematics. The ability to perform mathematics depend on spatial ability and memory, both of which are evolved traits, but evolved by our ancestors to solve a more immediate and pressing problem, that of navigating the environment. Mathematics itself is cultural, and so is writing, and indeed religion itself is also a cultural artifact, all of which are products of cognitive mechanisms that have evolved for other specific purposes. We know that religion is cultural because it is learned. Formal religions, like the Abrahamic religions, cannot be genetic by definition. They are entirely cultural in nature. But Dr. Weinstein makes a more general point, and that is that religious beliefs appear universal, and this would imply that such a universal trait must have some evolutionary utility. But in the same way as writing or mathematics have no dedicated cognitive networks, neither has religion. We can scan the brain of individuals who are contemplating religious matters. Certain areas of the brain can be identified as correlating with such activities, but these hubs of activity and the networks that support them are dedicated to other cognitive mechanisms, such as agency detection and intuitive reasoning. The suggestion that selection would eliminate behaviours that might be costly is weak when we consider superstitious behaviours in other animals. This superstitious behaviour is famously demonstrated by B.F. Skinner using pigeons. Let's take a look at the experiment.
And we're going to try another pigeon now, and I will try to pick out some particular pattern of behavior and make it a more frequent part of the repertoire of the bird. Very fine. This bird has been already conditioned to eat when the magazine sounds and the light flashes. Now we'll just watch its behavior a bit. It's not doing anything in particular, you see, but I'm going to try to get it to do something. Suppose I shape up the behavior of making a complete turn. What I do is simply, as I did then, to wait for some part of that behavior. There's more of it, you see. You can see that the effect is instantaneous. I'm waiting for it to turn counterclockwise now. And then I reinforce that movement. And I wait for a more pronounced movement than that. It's got to be more than that. There we go, all the way around.
So this type of behaviour is costly. The pigeon that revolves is using more energy than the one who just sits there patiently waiting for its reward. So how could a process that in theory should produce good solutions to particular problems result in an organism that displays such wasteful behaviours? And here we have to consider a subtle but important issue, and that is the brain is itself an evolved organ. Its cognitive mechanisms have evolved to address particular environmental challenges, but these mechanisms are not capable of processing all potential inputs, only a subset. Your mind has mechanisms for edge detection and length comparison, which is useful in determining perspective and therefore distance. But this cognitive mechanism is not solving the general problem. That would be computationally costly, even if it were possible. What your mind does do, however, is cheat. It employs a set of rules, which are less costly and more efficient. But this means that if input does not match expectation, then your mind is fooled. This evolved mechanism no longer produces the results it should, and this explains why optical illusions work even when we know they are illusions. Towards the end of his presentation, Dr. Weinstein wondered at the apparent odd state of affairs, in which we have minds that are programmed by culture that can be completely at odds with our genome. But in reality, this apparent paradox is illusory. The genome does not code for religious belief. There is no God module located in the frontal lobes, and there are no religious alleles. If there are no neurological networks in the human brain dedicated to religion, then evolution cannot select for it. What is present, however, are a multitude of cognitive modules evolved by our earliest ancestors to solve particular environmental problems, which when aggregated makes us susceptible to superstitious behaviours and religious beliefs. So if we follow this line of reasoning, it would be reasonable to conclude that religion is not an adaptation, and that religions in general have no evolutionary function as such. There is no such entity as religion that we could consider in an evolutionary context that would make any sense. Evolutionary adaptations are functional biological designs naturally selected to solve important problems in our ancestral environment. Evolutionary byproducts are traits that were not initially selected to have any direct utility. Nevertheless, as already detailed, evolutionary byproducts can acquire or co-opt functions for which they were not originally designed. Religious belief and practice involves a variety of cognitive systems, most having separate evolutionary histories. We might at this point wonder why religion is ubiquitous. Surely it must have at least some evolutionary utility, but we've already discovered that this is not the case. evolution would have been selecting for agency detection rather than deity, and our ancestors would have been more interested in predators and other competing humans, both physical threats that can be selected for. If we look at the evolutionary tree of religion itself, we see something interesting, and that is the root of all religions is animism. Given what we know about evolution, would it be possible to explain animism itself? I think we probably could. Also, if we look at how religions developed over time, we see something else that might be of interest, and that is, the more advanced human culture becomes, the more elaborate religion gets. Is this simply a coincidence? Or might we conclude that while we might posit a natural explanation for a predisposition to religious belief and superstition, the elaborate religions that we see today are primarily cultural products? And while a case might be made in relation to cultural and social benefit, the assumption that there might also be some evolutionary advantage does not seem to be supported by any substantial evidence. Before we end our adventure, I think we should consider the words of one of America's great thinkers, Robert Ingersoll, lawyer, politician, and orator. "I will not attack your doctrines or your creeds if they accord liberty to me. If they hold thought to be dangerous, if they aver that doubt is a crime, then I attack them one and all, because they enslave the minds of men." We end our adventure at this point. I hope you found something of interest in this video. If you would like to support my channel, I now have a Patreon page. If you're unable to support my works with Patreon, then you can share, like, or comment. It's all good. Thank you for watching.